After giving us a list of the descendants of Esau in chapter 36, Moses returns to the story of Jacob's sons, and one son in particular, the firstborn son of his favored wife Rachel. That's Joseph. Verse 1. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. The closing verses of chapter 35 recount the death of Isaac at Mamre, what later becomes known as Hebron. That's where Jacob settled down. Jacob takes the place of his father Isaac now in the plan and the promise of God to Abraham. Verse 2 is a recurring phrase in Genesis. It marks the end of one phase of the story and begins another. And in this case, it seals the story of Jacob and turns to the story of Joseph. The last part of verse 2 says, Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. As I said, Joseph was the first son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. His father had 4 sons by his 2 concubines, Zilpah and Bilhah. When it came time to take the flocks of Jacob to pasture, Joseph found himself with those sons. Because the family's flocks were so expansive, Leah's 6 sons took another portion of the flock to other pastures. Now, though it's not stated, because Leah was Jacob's first wife and the antagonism between Leah and Joseph's mother Rachel was intense, it's likely that Leah's sons despised Joseph and harassed him without let-up. And so Joseph went with the sons of Zilpah and Bilhah because, well, they were probably being less cruel to him. But Joseph witnessed inappropriate behavior in his brothers, and he ratted them out to dad. When Jacob confronted them, they knew that Joseph had done the deed. While Joseph's behavior portrays him as moral and ethical, being a standout in those things in the Bible, in his teen years, we see some immaturity and lack of wisdom. Thinking on his brothers was not a good idea. A couple of Proverbs speak of the wisdom of not recounting the errors of others. In Proverbs 10:12, we find this: hatred stirs up strife, but love covers sin. In Proverbs 17:9, he who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates friends. Ratting out his brothers turns out not to be Joseph's only act of youthful foolishness. Verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Jacob's favor of Joseph was obvious to the entire household. As he got older, Jacob made it more obvious that he intended to make Joseph the premier son and to pass that coveted birthright on to him. Now, we've already seen the intense animosity that can arise in a family in a contest over the birthright from the story of Jacob and his brother Esau. So imagine when you add a total of 12 brothers to the mix. As Jacob aged and knew that his end was coming, he made his intentions increasingly clear that Joseph would receive the firstborn privilege, though he was 11th out of the 12 sons. One of the ways that Jacob showed his favoritism of Joseph was by giving him what the text refers to as a tunic of many colors. Now, that translation is a holdover from earlier versions that attempt to translate the archaic and at that time unknown words that are used here. We now know that the garment referred to was one that extended to the wrists and the ankles. It was a garment worn by rulers and those who were typically exempt from manual labor. Regular laborers wore short-sleeved garments with a hem at the knee so that they had greater freedom of movement. The longer garment meant the person was of higher rank. Canaanite and Egyptian fashions of that time show these long-sleeved and hemmed garments as having a band of ornate color at the end of the sleeve and the hem. It served as a badge of office. Now, Jacob's gift of this special garment to Joseph, it was a way of signaling to the family that Joseph was being set up as the next patriarch, the ruler of the household. You can just imagine what kind of a response the rest of the brothers would show to him. Any pretense at civility was going to be banished. They would openly show their disdain for him. Joseph didn't encourage any thaw in their chilliness toward him by what happens next, verse 5. No, Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. And so he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were binding sheaves in the field. And then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, "Shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us?" And so they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. So here's more evidence of Joseph's youthful lack of wisdom. As the unfolding story reveals, this dream was prophetic. But that doesn't mean that Joseph needed to share it with his brothers. He ought to have realized that this would only serve to inflame their already brewing hatred towards him. Just because God speaks to you doesn't mean that it's something you have to share with others. It may be just for you. As we look at the Bible, we see that consistently when God wants his people to speak his message to others, he tells them to. Joseph received no such command, and he ought to have kept this revelation to himself. Joseph had to know by his brother's reaction that it was unwise to tell them of his dream. And yet, when he has another, he again tells them. Verse 9, then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me." And so he told it to his father and his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?" And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Joseph hadn't learned from his earlier error and repeated it when he had another dream that was similar to the first. But this time, not only did he see signs speaking of his brothers bowing down to him, but also his father and his wives, that is, Jacob's wives. Jacob rebuked Joseph for this breach of domestic etiquette, but also filed it away as something to keep in mind. Jacob had had his own prophetic dreams and knew that God does indeed reveal himself in special ways to his chosen instruments. This second dream of Joseph's is prophetic in more than just what it foretells about Jacob's family showing deference to him as the eventual ruler of Egypt. This dream forms the basis of the Apostle John's vision of the sun, moon, and stars representing the nation of Israel in Revelation chapter 12. But that is a study for another time. Verse 12. Then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And so he said to him, "Here I am." And then he said to him, "Please go and see if it's well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me." And so he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Now, you will probably remember that Shechem was the place where Simeon and Levi had murdered all the Canaanite men who were recovering from being circumcised because they thought that they were forging a covenant with Jacob's clan. Shechem was a monument to Simeon and Levi's treachery and brutality, and to the rest of the brothers' greed. It ought to have been a reminder to Jacob of what lengths his sons would go to in their wicked plans. Because of Joseph's earlier reports about his brother's shenanigans, Jacob now sent him on the mission of checking up on all the brothers. This was salt in the wound of the brothers' animosity towards Joseph. And so Joe heads north from the family base at Hebron to find his brothers, and it turns out they'd left Shechem for other pasture. Verse 15. Now a certain man found him, and there he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, "What are you seeking?" And so he said, "I'm seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are feeding their flocks." And the man said, "They've departed from here, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" And so Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. When Joseph arrived in the region of Shechem, his brothers were nowhere to be found. One of the locals found him searching the area and asked him if he could be of assistance. He told Joseph that Jacob's flocks had been taken to Dothan, which was a short distance to the north. Now, verse 18. Now when they, that is the brothers, saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. Then they said to one another, "Look, this dreamer is coming. Come, therefore, let us now kill him, cast him into some pit, and we shall say, 'Oh, some wild beast has devoured him.' We shall see what will become of his dreams." So some of the brothers were together when they first spotted Joseph. His distinctive garment identified him, and when he was still at a distance and out of earshot, they hatched a plot to off him. Just then Reuben, the firstborn, and the one the other brothers looked to as their leader, walked up, saw their furtive intentions, and asked what they were up to. Well, they told him, verse 21. But Reuben heard it. And he delivered him, that is Joseph, out of their hands and said, "Let us not kill him." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father." So Reuben quickly persuaded them not to kill Joseph, but to merely, confine him in one of the dry wells that were in the area. He appealed to their desire to put Joseph out of the way, but without killing him. Now, as we read on in the story, we can make a fairly safe assumption that it was treacherous Simeon who made the original suggestion to kill Joseph. The other brothers thought this harsh, but went along with it until Reuben intervened and suggested a plot a little less hard on their conscience. Reuben's real plan was to sneak back and rescue Joseph, bringing him home, and winning his father's favor because of the rescue. Reuben's previous failure in lying with one of his father's concubines had cost him dearly, and he probably thought this would restore the lost favor of his father. Verse 23. And so it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit. And the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat a meal. Then they lifted their eyes and looked. There was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood?" So Judah rightly analyzed the situation. What difference was there in killing Joseph outright or just leaving him to die of exposure and thirst in a pit? Either way, they'd have murdered him, and that would be something, they'd have to live with for the rest of their lives. So why not make profit out of it and sell him to this band of Ishmaelites that were from Midian that were passing by? So Judah was, of course, unaware of Reuben's plan to come back later and rescue Joseph. And so he says, verse 27, "Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let's not put our hand upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened. Then Midianite traders passed by, and so the brothers pulled Joseph up, lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. What perverse thinking is this on Judah's part? Let's not kill him, let's sell him? What's interesting, he doesn't say, "Hey, brothers, what are we thinking? Joseph may be a creep, and we may be right to be jealous of him, but kill him? Sell him? If we do either, don't we totally justify our fathers passing over us to make him the heir and the firstborn? And if they loved their fathers, would they not realize the loss of Jacob would destroy him? But they grab him, they rip off his distinctive tunic, they throw him into a pit, and then sit down to eat a meal." Now later we read that while he was in the pit and they were eating, he cried to them, he pleaded that they rescue him. But no, he has to listen to them debate his fate. He listens while Judah suggests that instead of leaving him in the pit to die of exposure, they could make some shekels off of him. Verse 29. Then Reuben returned to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. And he returned to his brothers and said, "The lad is no more, and I, where shall I go?" After Reuben's earlier intervention, he'd left the scene and not found out what Judah had proposed. When he returned to the pit to rescue Joseph, he found him gone and told it to the others, and that's when they filled him in, verse 31. And so they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Do you know whether it's your son's tunic or not?" And he recognized it and said, "It's my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, and he said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him. From this point on, Jacob seems a broken man. This loss and the grief that it brought became a crushing weight from which he never really recovers. Thus, Jacob's favoritism of Joseph ended up costing him his son. Verse 36. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. When the Ishmaelites arrived in Egypt, they set up shop, began to trade, and one of their prizes was Joseph, who was quickly sold to Potiphar, the chief commander of Pharaoh's personal bodyguard. We'll pick it up at this point in the next chapter. you.